Okay, hi everybody, and again I apologize for being a little late. As you know, there's something going on in the old city, and as well as the new elections or the new government, so everything is kind of coming together. But today's shir is again sponsored by Chaya Shifra bat Galila Yocheved and Galila Yocheved bat Devorah for a Refuah Shelema b'soch Shachol Yisrael. And once again, for the young man, Binyamin Yisroel Chaim ben Chanita, that's going through a very, very difficult situation right now. And he also is very much in our prayers and our thoughts. And may the learning, again, be a Refuah Shelema for him and also for all of the Cholei Yisrael. The Parsha that we're dealing this week is really, in many, many ways, one of the most mysterious mitzvahs of the Torah, and this is the mitzvah of Parah Aduma, the Red Heifer, and in fact it is described that the name of the Parsha is Chukat. Chukat is a chok. A chok is a specifically technical term that's utilized for those commandments that do not make sense from a rational perspective. We have hukim and mishpatim. Mishpatim are the types of commandments that even if God wouldn't have commanded, I would have intuitively understood their importance. Typically interpersonal laws, don't steal, don't murder. Most people kind of understand that those are wrong. But a chok is a davar. Now again, I don't think it would be correct to say a mitzvah without a reason. Certainly God must have his reasons. But a mitzvah whose reason eludes us, we're not really clear about it. And of all of the hukim, Parah Aduma is considered to be the most enigmatic. You know, King Solomon writes in Kohelet that he sought wisdom, but he saw it was too far from him. And the Medrash explains that he gave reasons for every mitzvah of the Torah. Once he got to Parah Aduma, he was stuck. And he realized, therefore, that even those parts of the Torah that he thought he understood, in fact, he actually did not penetrate. It isn't just Parah Aduma is a chok. It's like everything turns out to be a chok, because there are so many levels of divine wisdom that whatever we perceive of the Torah is nothing more than the tip of an iceberg. And there are so many levels under that tip that, again, the greater you are in Torah, maybe you get more of a deeper level, but still, most of it remains totally beyond us. And this is the chok of Parah Aduma. Now again, just to be sure people know what it is, I'm sure most of you are familiar. This is a specific ritual that is necessary for a person to be purified when they have come in contact with a dead body. We know in the Torah, and I will actually talk about this at length later in the shir, but just as an introduction, when a person comes in contact with a dead body, and by contact I mean either touching it, moving it, carrying it, or even being under the same roof with the dead body, even if I didn't touch it at all, the Torah says the person is tameh. He is ritually impure for a period of 7 days. Halachically, just to be sure we understand this, what does it mean to be ritually impure? It doesn't mean you can't go to shul. You can go to shul, you can daven, you put on tefillin, you keep Shabbos, you keep kosher, we count you for a minyan. But it does mean that a person cannot enter the Beis HaMikdash, cannot eat the korbanos. If they're a kohen, they cannot eat truma. Basically, the laws of Tuma are primarily concerned with access to the Beis HaMikdash. And he's tameh for 7 days, but in order to be purified, he must undergo purification rituals. And the purification rituals for Tumat Met are 2. Ritual 1 is he must be sprinkled with a mixture of the water and the ashes of the red heifer on day 3 of his 7-day period and on day 7. And after that, on day 7, he goes to the mikveh and he will become tahor at nightfall. Okay, so that basically means if I went to a funeral and I became tameh to a met, that's called my day one. So if I did it on Sunday, so halachically I would have to be sprinkled with the ashes and spring water on the third day, which would be Tuesday. And then on the seventh day, well, that raises a little bit of a problem because you don't do it on Shabbos, so everything would have to be pushed off. And then that'd be on Sunday. And then Sunday afternoon, I go to the mikveh. I am tahor Sunday night. Now, the problem is, of course, that Bizman Hazeh, although we do have mikveh, we don't have para aduma. So what that actually means is, if anybody was ever in a cemetery in their entire life, we remain in a permanent condition of tumat met, the impurity of met, until we have the afer, the ashes of the para aduma. And that is why you hear the statement over and over again that Bizman Hazeh, everybody is considered to be tamei met. Now again, without a Beit HaMikdash, that does not affect us that much, because we don't have a temple anyway, but this is the halachic reason why we don't enter the Harabayit, etc., because of the status of tumat met. Now every once in a while, you hear some excitement that they discovered a para aduma. Now, let me make it very, very clear. Again, you probably know this, I apologize. But the reason I mention it is because for many years I labored under a misconception. I used to think, I guess maybe as a child, that para aduma meant you had to find a fire engine red cow. Now, that is very rare. In fact, as far as I know, there is no such thing. So you have to understand that the actual color of a para aduma is a very common color for cows. It's kind of the orange-brown. Orange-brown is, a lot of cows have that. So the reason why the para aduma is rare is not because the color is so unusual, but it's because of the virtual 100% requirement that there not be anything other than red. So halacha permits there to be up to one black hair. Okay, well, I don't know how many hairs a cow has, but it's in the millions. And you have to examine it meticulously, hair by hair by hair by hair. And if there are two hairs that are not the requisite color, it is disqualified as a para aduma. In addition, there are many other laws. It could never have borne a yoke. It could never have done any work, even if you put, if I'm the owner of a para aduma, and I put my briefcase on top of the para for a moment when I went to do something, para aduma is pasul, because carrying a load makes it pasul. If indeed it mated, if it bred with a bull or something, that would make it pasul. So there are many, many halachot. Even if you have a para aduma, it's very easy for it to become disqualified in a variety of ways. But every once in a while, I think right now that people claim there are para adumot in the world. Like I think there's some fundamentalist Christian farmer that has a para aduma, and he's in contact with the rabbis in Lakewood to be sure that he doesn't do anything wrong.
How do they know that they should tell somebody?
Oh, because they study the Bible too. They read the Bible. It's in the Bible, and they read it, and they contact the rabbis because they know it's a Jewish ritual for the temple. And again, as you know, the restoration of the temple from the perspective of Christianity is bound up with a whole bunch of other theological concepts that we don't accept, but it does excite fundamentalist Christians. But here I just want to point out, I don't want to get too technical because this actually is a very technical halachic discussion, but I just want to point out that even if you have a para aduma, what are you going to do with it? Because here's the problem. The problem is the para aduma is shechted, it is then burnt into ashes, it's then mixed it with spring water, etc. And then we have this powerful potion that can be metaher people. Wonderful. But the problem is, all of that stuff has to be done by Kohanim that are in a state of ritual purity. So how do they become ritually pure to make the para aduma? Now you may ask me, well, how did it work in the past? The way it worked in the past was the following. They had ashes from the first Parah Adumah that Moshe Rabbeinu made. Now, when the supply grew low, they would still have enough to purify the few Kohanim that were needed, and those few who were pure were able to make a new Parah Adumah with all of the ritual. In other words, you had to have some leftovers from the old Parah Adumah in order to purify the Kohanim to make a new Parah Adumah. Because if you don't have some residual old ashes of the pre-existing Parah Adumah, then you don't have anybody that can do anything with the new Parah Adumah. And that's our problem. So the fact that we have a Parah Adumah does not in and of itself help us. We will not be able to purify the Jewish people. So what's going to happen eventually? So how will we ever become pure? We'll become pure because one of the things Eliyahu HaNavi, who is also Pinchas, Eliyahu HaNavi is a reincarnation of Pinchas, the Kohen Gadol. Eliyahu HaNavi is going to bring back some ashes of the last. There were actually 9 Parah Adumot. Mashiach will be the 10th. Of the 9th Parah Adumah, will purify some of the Kohanim that are needed to do the avoda. Those few Kohanim will then be able to shecht and burn and prepare the new Parah Adumah that will be sufficient miraculously to be mitaher all of Am Yisrael. Okay, so you have to understand that although I guess on some level we could say the fact that we have a Parah Adumah, perhaps God is giving us a sign that we're approaching the Messianic age, but still keep in mind that until we get the ashes of an old Parah Adumah, we're really stuck. There is no particular way we can use the Parah Adumah to effect purity. Yeah.
I meant to ask you about the Kohanim that's supposed to go to the cemetery. Are they still Tomei?
Yes. So this is an important point. A Kohen is, of course, normally not allowed to come in contact with the dead, but the Torah makes an exception for the relatives of father and mother and wife and child and brother and sister, unmarried sister. And the Kohen is not only permitted to become Tamei, but he's even obligated to become Tamei. It becomes a mitzvah. But l'maisa, that does not change. The fact that he is supposed to make himself Tamei does not negate the fact that he is Tamei, and such a Kohen would still need to be sprinkled on day 3 and on day 7.
But if he never went to the cemetery even for his relatives?
Oh, then he's not Tamei. He's not Tamei, no, because the Tumah is not the fact that somebody died. The Tumah is only if you were in contact with the dead body.
Then they should be okay to sprinkle...
Yeah. Oh, you're asking why can't I assume that a Kohen is... that's good. That may be possible. But let me just point out, there's another concern, at least, and that is Chutz La'aretz is considered to be automatically Tumat Met. So which actually means any Kohen who was ever in Chutz La'aretz automatically has the status of a Tamei Met, whether he lived in Chutz La'aretz or whether he was traveling there. So that's a whole other issue. But if you have a Kohen who never left Eretz Yisrael and never became Tamei Lamet, theoretically he could be Tahor and he could do this. Assuming he's a Kohen, of course, that's another issue that would have to be determined, because today, being a Kohen just means, you get the first Aliyah, so we rely on anybody who says he's a Kohen. A person walks into Shul and says he's a Kohen, so we accept his word. But when you want to do service in the Beit HaMikdash, the evidentiary standard is much, much higher. And many, many Kohanim would actually not be able to prove their kahuna status for purposes of the service in the temple, or Parah Adumah. Yeah.
I just wondered, because of an article I read a few years ago, that there is a way of from the blood test, to determine if you are in fact a real Kohen. Yeah. So it is true that there is a DNA genetic marker that's fairly accurate that can show male descent from Aaron. The problem is this. The problem is
that cannot establish kahuna. Let me give you a very simple example. Let's imagine you have a Kohen, and a Kohen marries a non-Jewish woman, which of course is forbidden. They have a child. Now that child is not only not a Kohen, that child is a goy. But because he is in the male line of Aaron, he will have the genetic marker. So in a sense, therefore, the absence of the marker might be halachic proof that he's not a Kohen. That's true. The presence of the marker cannot establish kahuna, because there are a lot of examples. If a Kohen married a divorced woman, there are many, many ways in which you could be the male descendant of a Kohen and not be a Kohen. Marrying a guy, you're a guy. Marrying a divorced woman, you're a halal. Right? So there are different situations. Yeah,
doesn't the Kohen who sprinkles the one that's tameh, doesn't he have to be tahor?
Right.
So how does that happen? In other words, you don't have any Kohanim that are tahor. So even though you have the part of the ashes of the part of the ma, how does that help?
No, that you're correct, but that was my point. Eliyahu Hanavi will be Eliyahu Hanavi, who's a Kohen, will be the initial sprinkler. So he'll be the one that'll start the process, and then you'll have other Kohanim who are now tahor who can keep on going on.
But then he becomes tameh.
Well, okay, that's what I'm going to talk about. That's the next thing I want to talk about. Now, so again, I just want you to familiarize yourself a little bit with what is the ritual of Parah Adumah, so you understand what it is. By the way, you may wonder. I mean, how many people needed when there's a Beit Hamikdash? How many people will need the services of the Parah Adumah? Basically, everybody to bring the Korban Pesach, the pilgrimage festivals. So the question becomes, how long can this supply last? You're talking about one parah. So another thing you need to know is this. You actually don't have to use up the ashes, because essentially what you do is you mix the ashes with spring water, and then you dip the hyssop bush in, or the Kohen does, and he sprinkles, but he doesn't have to take any ash. The water itself, the water that is mixed with the ashes, has the koach of being matayer. So you actually don't have to deplete the ashes. As the water supply goes down, you just add more water. And as long as the water touches the ashes, the water has the koach. And that's why the Parah Adumah can actually last for years and years and years and years, because you actually don't have to deplete the actual ashes themselves. So again, just something to be aware of, to know what the procedure is. I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Sorry, is there a ratio of like how much ashes to how much water?
No. The only halachic requirement is that the water must cover the ashes. So essentially, it's more water than ashes. Okay. Now, here's the question. Let's go back to the initial idea that the Parah Adumah is called chok, the inexplicable mitzvah of the Torah. Now here's the thing. L'chaira, there are many, many commandments in the Torah that are frankly inexplicable. This is not the only one. You're not allowed to wear woolen linen. Tefillin have to be square and black. If you're simply looking at hukim, why is Parah Adumah the paradigmatic chok that even stymied Shlomo HaMelech? What makes it more difficult than many things in the Torah that, I don't fully understand? But, we do it. So the Meforshim explain that the reason why Parah Adumah is the chok par excellence is not because it's simply mysterious. A lot of stuff in the Torah is mysterious. But because it is self-contradictory. It is the contradiction of Parah Adumah that makes it difficult to grasp. And that is what you alluded to. And that is, on one hand, if I am tameh, and I'm sprinkled with this spring water and ashes, I become pure. So it's a vehicle of purification. But there's another halacha that says all of the people that were involved in transporting the ashes and the like, they become tameh. They become tameh. So the famous expression, mitaher Es hatmeim, paradox, right? Mitaher es hatmeim. It purifies the impure. Umitamei es hatahorim. It contaminates the pure. That's a chok. How can the same thing do opposite things? Now, this raises yet another question. Again, I don't want to be overly technical, but I want people to get a picture. So people sometimes ask the question, if that's the case, then how can you ever get all of the Jewish people in a state of purity? Isn't there going to be the last guy holding the bag? Because here's the problem. Let's say I'm a Kohen. I make you tahor, so you're tahor, but now I'm tamei. So now I got to get sprinkled by another guy. So I'm tahor. Again, it's 3 and 7. So I'm tahor, but he's tamei. So it keeps on going and going and going and going and going. So there's got to be one guy at the end. He's like designated tamei, that he can't become tar. So how does that work? So I want to clarify something. Again, this is very important just in terms of basic knowledge. The tuma that requires being sprinkled with para aduma is the tuma of tumat met. But the tuma of para aduma, all you need is mikvah to get rid of. In other words, like this: if I sprinkle you, I'm not tamei met. I didn't touch a dead body. I have a new tuma called the tuma of para aduma. Well, how do I become tahor? I just jump in a mikvah and I'm fine. So the last guy holding the bag jumps in the mikvah and he's tahor. In other words, he doesn't need the purification of para aduma if his tuma is para aduma tuma. You only need the sprinkling of para aduma when your tuma is tumat met. So that breaks the infinite sequence that you otherwise would have. Okay. Now, let me share with you an astounding vort from the Vilna Gaon, which I once said it at a group where there were people from Lakewood, and they literally denied that the Vilna Gaon could have said it, because but he does say it, and you'll see why it is a fairly astounding proposition that maybe in the yeshiva world would not be so accepted. That is, all of us know the famous teaching of Chazal that the Torah is compared to water. And there are many, many reasons why Torah is compared to water. Water is necessary for life. Torah is necessary for life. Water purifies. Torah purifies. Water, by gravity, goes from the high ground to the low ground. That's how rivers flow. So the Torah leaves the arrogant and it goes to the humble. Right? These are famous ideas. But the Vilna Gaon gives an amazing other parallel to water. He says water has what we call a koach hatzmicha. Water facilitates growth. You pour water on seeds, you get growth. But the water is indifferent whether the growth is a positive thing or a negative thing. Meaning to say, water will facilitate growth if you pour it on beautiful flowers and vegetables and grain. And water will facilitate growth if it's weeds or poison ivy or whatever it is. Water is matzmiach, whatever is embedded in the ground, whether it's good or whether it's bad. So says the Vilna Gaon, Torah is exactly that way. If a person in the panimiyat, in his internal character, has midot tovot, kindness, generosity, goodness, humility, the learning of the Torah is going to intensify and deepen those midos tovos. Now that, of course, is not exceptional. We would expect that. But what's unexpected is the other thought. If a person has in his heart arrogance, selfishness, and egotism, the learning of the Torah might actually make him worse. Now you can understand this rationally. If a person, for example, is very competitive and arrogant, then his success in the learning of the Torah could be another avenue for the one-upmanship that he can show. Now this is what the Lakewood person denied. The Lakewood person said, it's impossible that the Vilna Gaon said that learning Torah can make a person worse. So I said to him, well, don't we sometimes see a very bad midot among people who learn Torah? So his answer was, they would have been worse without it. Okay, maybe I can't prove it, but nevertheless, and in fact, I want to point out that the Vilna Gaon statement in this context is there are a lot of contradictions. It's very, very far from a simple matter, because there are other statements in rabbinic literature, and the Vilna Gaon himself talked about it, that learning Torah refines a person, it makes a person better, it elevates a person. There's a famous Maimer Chazal where God says, let the Jewish people not even believe in me, but study my Torah, because the light of my Torah will bring them back to me. That's why I often say, when it comes to Jewish outreach, there are people and programs that say you can't really start learning Torah with somebody unless you first convince them that the Torah is from God and it's divine and it's not man-made, and only then can we learn Torah, because if they don't accept that the Torah is from God, then they're not going to absorb anything. And therefore, before we learn Mishnah, before we learn Chumash, before we learn Gemara, we have to have our 40-part series on how do we prove the divine origin of the Torah. But in truth, I would submit that is not necessary. In fact, we could start off by saying, okay, I believe the Torah is from God, you don't, but even you would say the Torah may have wise things to say. Let's learn what the Torah says. And when a person learns what the Torah says, there's a spiritual power in the Torah that can make a person more receptive. So sometimes it's worthwhile to start with what you might call second-order questions, as opposed to first-order questions, because first-order questions are often not answerable until a person is already exposed to the guts of Torah learning. So this is a complicated issue, meaning there are passages that say Torah makes a bad person better, but the Vilna Gaon is saying Torah makes a bad person worse, because Torah is like water. It magnifies whatever the person has. An amazing, amazing statement. And especially coming from the Vilna Gaon, because as you know, the Vilna Gaon was not a slack when it came to Torah learning. I mean, the Vilna Gaon was not a person that said, don't learn, spend your time saying Tehillim. I mean, the Vilna Gaon spent much of his life learning 22 hours a day, and only slept 2 hours, and those 2 hours were divided into 4 sections of 30 minutes, so he never slept more than 30 minutes at a time. He would measure his Bitul Torah per year in terms of numbers of minutes. And I assure you, even what he called Bitul Torah would probably not even be considered Bitul Torah. In fact, there's a whole story. He once came to a city for a chasana, and in those days, it was such a big deal to see the Vilna Gaon that people would actually charge. In other words, he was sleeping on a second story. Somebody would set up a ladder, and he would allow people to climb up on the ladder, and they get to watch the Vilna Gaon sleep for a minute, and they pay money, etc. So people were watching the Vilna Gaon sleep, and the story goes that he slept 31 minutes, and he got up, and he started sobbing and crying that this is a sleepy town. It took away 1 minute of his Torah learning. And it's recorded that the town was heartbroken, that they hurt the Vilna Gaon so much. And the Vilna Gaon said he's not going to come back to this city. Somehow they took away a minute. So the story is that 25 years later he had to come back to the city again, and he only slept 29 minutes. And he says, Baruch Hashem, Hashem gave me back what I lost. And it's recorded the whole city made a Yom Tov that day. So the Vilna Gaon was machshiv. He considered Torah learning to be the greatest, most important thing. And yet, he says you have to work on your midos. Because if the midos are rotten, the Torah can accentuate rotten midot. That is why in reality it is said that the Vilna Gaon was actually the spiritual forerunner of the Musar movement of Rabbi Yisroel Salanter, which emphasized character building and midos. And you can actually trace this, because the Vilna Gaon's primary disciple was Rav Chaim of Volozhin. And Rav Chaim of Volozhin had many, many disciples, but one of his great disciples was a hidden tzaddik, Rav Zundel of Salant. And Rav Zundel of Salant was not a Rosh Yeshiva and was not a Rav. He was a woodcutter and a very poor worker, but he was a great, great hidden tzaddik. And many people didn't know who he was. But there was a little boy that would follow him around, because the little boy, surreptitiously, the little boy suspected that there was something special about this man. That little boy was none other than Rabbi Yisroel Chaim, as a little boy. And he would catch Rav Zundel in the act of whatever mitzvos he would do, the secret stuckos that he would do, the chesed that he would do without anybody knowing about it, the learning that he would do. And Rav Zundel was his Rebbe. And Rabbi Yisroel Chaim said over and over again that Rav Zundel of Salant was the most important influence in his life. So it makes a lot of sense to me that you can actually trace Rabbi Yisroel Salanter's activities to a Messiah, to a tradition that goes back to the Vilna Gaon. So let's go back to Parah Aduma for a moment.
The concept
Yeah.
of Derech Eretz Kadmon LaTorah. So
Yeah, that's right.
These mices that you're bringing, are
Yeah.
these fables or are they real?
You know, who knows? The old story, they say it by Hasidic stories, but the same is true for non-Hasidic stories. They say, if you believe they actually happened, you're a fool. If you believe they couldn't have happened, you're an apikoros. Meaning, the people are righteous enough that these things could have happened. Whether they actually happened, who knows? Who knows? You never know. But certainly, the idea of the Vilna Gaon sleeping a half an hour, generally, that is recorded. Now, it wasn't his whole life, but a number of years he lived with that standard. Now, why am I bringing in this fascinating digression? Because I want to suggest that it answers what you might call a minor interpretive question that the Meforshim say. Zot chukat haTorah. This is the inexplicable law of the Torah. So the Meforshim ask a question. Maybe the question wouldn't bother you so much, but it is a question the Meforshim ask. Parah Aduma is only one mitzvah, so why say this is the chok of the whole Torah? Simply say this is the chok of Parah Aduma. In other words, say Zot chukat haParah. Why say Zot chukat haTorah? The Meforshim asked the kasha. And I would suggest maybe that according to the Vilna Gaon, you can actually give a beautiful answer. Because the chok of Parah Aduma is paradox. How can something be good and purify and at the same time make you tameh? But according to the Vilna Gaon, the paradox of Parah Aduma is a paradox of the Torah itself, in which if you have good midot, the Torah makes you better. If you have bad midot, the Torah makes you worse. So the Torah itself can purify and contaminate. So Zot Chukat HaTorah means the same paradox you have in Parah Aduma, you actually have in the Torah itself. Recently a very, very dear friend of mine was nifter. Some of you may have heard about it. There was an article in Mishpacha magazine. Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, who was the head of the Association of Jewish Outreach Professionals, which is a organization of kiruv workers. And for many, many years, he was the head of the Atlantic Seaboard NCSY. He was a Hasidic Yid, but he worked with public school kids, and he made many of them religious, B'nai Torah. He was really phenomenal. And one of the NCSY is a co-ed organization, and sometimes the tznius is not 100%, and etc. So the perennial problem that NCSY always has is that they want to recruit teachers and leaders who are from yeshiva people, but some of the yeshivas don't like their students to go to NCSY programs because they're co-ed and the like. So my own Rosh Hashiva, Rav Ruderman, once described NCSY. He says, NCSY is like Parah Aduma. He said, it purifies those who are far from Torah. It really makes them religious. But on the other hand, it may have a negative influence on those who are from. So this was one of Rabbi Lowenbraun's perennial challenges, how to recruit people for NCSY. The pshara was that they tried to get married people, or whatever it would be. But I was involved with the NCSY in the 1980s, and really it was a very, very amazing experience. When I first came there, and I saw the co-ed stuff, and these were, high school kids, and they were fooling around and running around and screaming and yelling, and I was wondering, how are you going to get something good out of this? Like, what's going on? It's just Wildkeit, as we would say. And yet, after a year, after 2 years, after 3 years, those very same kids became very, very wonderful from B'nai and Benos Torah. And he was able to create that type of atmosphere. And therefore to this day, I have tremendous, unbounded admiration, of course, for Rabbi Lowenbraun, Zichrono Livracha, but for NCSY generally. It's a really, really phenomenal program. But okay. But be it as it may, that was my Rosh Hashiva's remark that he considered NCSY to be a little bit like the Para Aduma. Now, there's another answer to why it says the chok of the Torah. And Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says, because in a way, your whole attitude towards Torah as a whole, depends on how you deal with the chok. Let me explain this. When I keep the parts of the Torah that make sense to me, a lot of things make sense. So you never know. Am I doing it because God commanded it? Or am I doing it because I'm a fellow traveler with God, because my agenda and God's agenda happen to be the same at this point? Am I serving God? Or am I serving myself? The chok is the ultimate test. Do you keep the parts of the Torah that don't make sense to you? And that is exemplary of your attitude towards the Torah as a whole. The chok marks you as an Eved Hashem. The mishpat does not mark you as an Eved Hashem, because maybe you're doing it on your own. And Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says, and especially, human beings rebel against having to do something. We pride ourselves on autonomy, on choice. So when something makes sense to me, I choose to do it. When something is a chok, I am mevatel myself, I nullify myself to the higher authority. And human beings don't like that process of nullification. Chaim Shmulevitz gives a beautiful example of this. If you remember at the end of the book of Shmuel Beis, when David is being pursued by his own son, Avshalom. So there's a man, Shimi ben Gera, who is of the family of Shaul. And Shimi ben Gera is throwing rocks at David, and he's saying, God is punishing you because of what you did to my relative Shaul, and you deserve it. And Yoav ben Tzeruiah, who is David's general, who is very quick to the sword, wants to kill Shimi ben Gera, and David does not let him. In fact, Shimi ben Gera is the ancestor of Mordechai. And David utters very immortal words, which are theologically actually subject to a big dispute. If God wouldn't want me to be humiliated, it wouldn't be happening. And if it happens, it is the will of Hashem, and I must accept it. And I cannot lash out and kill him for shaming me. This opens up a real Pandora's box of discussion. Can one human being harm another human being if it's not God's decree that the person should be harmed? David HaMelech is saying no, and Chovos HaLevavos takes that position. There are other positions in Jewish philosophy. We'll leave it for another time. Now, what's interesting is, though, that I read this and I admire David HaMelech. Wow, what patience, what acceptance, what humility. And yet, there's a real problem. When David's on his deathbed and he gives instructions to Shlomo, it's kind of like, I hate to say it this way, but it's kind of like the Godfather. He instructs him, I have a bunch of enemies. Be sure you finish them off one way or the other. And he mentions specifically, Shimi ben Gera, don't let him get away with this. So, just reading the psukim, what's going on? I mean, David had this attitude, I accept whatever God is giving me. And on his deathbed he says, finish him off. So it's a little complicated. It's not so clear what the answer is, but one answer might be that Shimi ben Gera in fact deserved to die because of the disrespect that he showed a king. That's called Moreid b'malchut. You rebel against the king, you're Chayav Misa. But David did not want to kill him when he was in the immediate pain and humiliation, because David would be afraid that perhaps he's not acting l'shem shamayim, he's acting for personal revenge. So he waited until he cooled down and then made an objective judgment. That's one way of learning. Okay, but be it as it may, what was the plan that Shlomo devised? The plan was, he told Shimi ben Gera, because of your disrespect to my father, I am confining you to Jerusalem. You're under, not house arrest, you're under city arrest. And the day that you leave the city, you're going to be Chayav Misa. Okay? Don't leave the city or you're in big trouble. So the story goes that Shimi ben Gera lost some donkeys, and his servants went out looking for the donkeys, and Shimi went with his servants to look for donkeys. And obviously Shlomo Melech had guards watching for this. Shimi ben Gera was apprehended, he was executed. Now, what type of idiot would do something like that? He was told if he leaves the city, he's going to die. Now, he didn't go because it was his mother's funeral. I mean, you know, a person might say, some things happen, I'm going to go no matter what. It wasn't even such a big deal. He lost donkeys. Okay, donkeys are expensive, but he has people looking for them. So he's going to put his life in danger, and he knows very well that he's going to be watched. So what's going on? Like, it's an idiotic thing to do. It's not a rational thing to do. So Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says, Shlomo HaMelech was a good reverse psychologist. Had he not told Shimi, you can't leave the city, Shimi would have no interest in leaving the city. But as soon as Shlomo HaMelech tells him, you can never leave the city again, it becomes unbearable to stay in the city. I have to get out. I have to get out. Right? If somebody were to tell you, you can never have chocolate again the rest of your life, at that moment, there'll be this unbelievable yearning to have chocolate, even if even if you don't even care about chocolate that much. Never to have it in my life. Because when we're told we can't do something, right, we don't like to be mukhrach. Mukhrach means forced. The chok is the paradigm of mukhrach, because it doesn't make sense to me, but I do it anyway. That shows true obedience to God. This is the way it works. The husband that wants to take out the garbage so his wife will have an easier time, so he's about to take out the garbage. He has the garbage in his hands. And then there's a voice from the other room that says, please take out the garbage. So some husbands, not me, but some husbands will feel an instinctive tightening of the chest. I don't want to be told what to do. Don't nag me. I'm going to do it anyway. Don't tell me what to do, etc. And this even expresses itself in halacha. We know that when a person is bar mitzvah, there's a mitzvah to make a seudah. We make a festive celebration because of a bar mitzvah. Again, technically that's only if it's on the birthday itself, but no, that's called a seudat mitzvah. Why is there a mitzvah to celebrate a bar mitzvah? So the reason is, this is based on a statement in the Gemara, Gadol ha-mitzuveh v'yoseh mimi she'eino mitzuveh v'yoseh. He who does commandments that they're commanded to do get more reward than people who do commandments they don't have to do. Meaning, interestingly enough, if you do a commandment that you're not commanded to do, you still get reward. But it's lower than the reward of a mitzvah v'yoseh. This is very relevant for women, by the way. Women are exempt from many time-bound commandments. Women are exempt from lulav, and women are exempt from sukkah. There are exceptions, but let's say lulav and sukkah, women are exempt. But if a woman wants to take lulav, or a woman wants to take sukkah, sit in a sukkah, she gets reward. She gets rewarded by Hashem for a mitzvah, but it's a lower reward because she's an eina mitzvah. By the way, very fascinating machlokes, Ashkenazim and Sfardim, based on the Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam. If a woman voluntarily does a mitzvah taseh that she's exempt from, is she allowed to make a bracha asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav? The Rambam and Rav Yosef Karo, who follows the Rambam, actually paskin that a woman cannot make a bracha. It would be a bracha in vain, because since she doesn't have the mitzvah, how can she say the words, Asher Kiddishanu, God sanctified us with His commandments? So many Sfardim, other than Moroccan Sfardim, follow the rule that women who take lulav or sit in the sukkah do not make a bracha. On the other hand, Ashkenazim follow the rule of Rabbeinu Tam, which is codified by the Ramah, that not only can a woman do the mitzvah, everybody says she could, but she can even make a bracha on the mitzvah, because the statement, Asher Kiddishanu, that Hashem sanctified us, b'mitzvotav, does not mean Hashem commanded me, the person doing it, but Hashem sanctified the Jewish nation. Okay, but be it as may, bottom line is that when you do a mitzvah that you're not commanded, you get less reward than when you are commanded. And going back to bar mitzvah, that's why bar mitzvah is joyous, because when the child was doing mitzvahs as a 12-year-old, it was eino mitzvah. He'll get reward, but he was not commanded. Now that he's commanded, that's a joyous occasion. That's the makor. That is the source of bar mitzvah. Now the question is this: why is it the case that if you do a mitzvah that you're commanded, you get more reward? Couldn't you make the opposite argument? Meaning, if all I'm doing is what I'm expected to do, okay, I did my job, that's good, but I didn't go beyond it. If I do something I don't have to do, it's like time and a half. If I work in my regular working hours, I get a regular salary. I do overtime, I get more. So one could make the argument that if I voluntarily do things I didn't have to do to serve Hashem, I should get more reward than people who just do their job. So Tosfos says in Masechet Avodah Zarah a great psychological insight. Tosfos says, once you become commanded to do something, the Yetzer Hara creates a resistance against doing it. So when I do things that I'm not commanded, I'm doing it because I want to do it. All right, that's fine. I want to do it. But when I do things because I have to do it, that's actually much harder. It's much, much harder, because human beings rebel. That's why, in the Reform movement, over the past 25 years, it moves in both directions, but on some things, the Reform movement has become much more traditional. On some things, obviously the left agenda has skewed it in other directions. But in terms of rituals, Hebrew, things like that, the Reform movement is much more traditional than it used to be. And one of the positive developments in the Reform movement is more and more Reform congregants are putting on tefillin. So tefillin is now a growing phenomenon in Reform congregations. That's the good news. The disheartening news is that it's almost 100% women that are doing it. There is no growth of tefillin among men. There's only growth of tefillin among women. How do you explain that? Well, a lot of things. Women are more spiritual than men. That actually has a lot of truth. But one answer might be women are exempt from putting on tefillin. Men are obligated. So when it comes to obligations, we rebel. When it comes to optional expressions on our own, that we're willing to do. Right? We're willing to do extra things more than we're willing to do mandatory things. So going back to, swinging it back to the Parsha, Zot Chukat HaTorah, Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says, it is the chok, the unconditional submission to that which does not appeal to my logic, that really shows my connection to the Torah overall. That I'm not just doing it to satisfy me, but I am mevatel myself, I nullify myself to the Almighty. Now, let me just end with one final idea here. That is, throughout the shir, we've been emphasizing that the primary chok of Para Aduma is the paradox. Paradox is the difficulty here, that it's mitameh, the pure, and it's mitaher, it purifies the impure. And this is considered to be a chok, and even Shlomo HaMelech didn't fully understand it. But notwithstanding that fact, the Mefarshim try to give some havana, some understanding of the nature of the paradox. And that is the following. Para Aduma is an antidote, so to speak, to the impurity of Met. Why did death come into the world to begin with? So if you'll recall, Adam and Chava were originally supposed to live forever. Because of the chait of the Eitz Hadas, eating from the forbidden fruit, death came into the world. And Adam and Chava were nichshal, they stumbled in that chait because of the snake, because of the nachash that enticed Chava, who then enticed Adam. What was the primary enticement of the nachash? So Rav Tzadok learns that the primary enticement was an appeal to the egotism and arrogance of man. The key words are, the day you eat from this fruit, you will be like God, to know good and evil. In other words, however you understand this very, very difficult Parsha, what is being offered is a God pill. Right? Remember, like the Matrix, the red pill, the blue pill, etc. It says, take this pill, take this fruit. You will be God. Ultimate ego trip. So death came into the world because of the defect of kavod and egotism. And here is the thing that's difficult. In many ways, and I think we've spoken about this, man is godlike. We are, after all, made in the image of God. We have the power of creativity, the power of free will, the power to destroy, the power to create, although not ex nihilo. We can't create something from nothing, but we can create many, many things, including coronavirus, apparently. Right? Things can be created, positive and very, very destructive, and the like. So we are godlike. And that godlike part of us is very important. I mentioned last week Rav Soloveitchik's idea that is the majesty of man. But at the same time, that can lead to arrogance and ego. And therefore, death is the great demarcation point between the Creator and the creation. Death is the ultimate reminder that we are not God, with all that we can accomplish. So instead of looking at death as a punishment, death is the necessary sign that separates us from God, despite the fact that we are so godly in many, many ways. So if you correlate death with kavod, you can now understand why the purification rituals of death. How do I become liberated from death? How do I become separated from death? By humility and submission. So this does not explain the paraduma totally, why a cow, why red, but it does explain the notion of being sprinkled with ashes. Because ashes is the ultimate symbol of humility and self-abnegation. When Avraham Avinu pleads for Sodom, Avraham Avinu says, Anochi, Afor va'efer, I am dust and ashes. So the correlation is this. Death comes into the world because of ego and arrogance and gaiva. I become liberated from death by connecting to humility and submission and self-abnegation. Again, borrowing Rav Soloveitchik's typology that we discussed last week, death comes into the world because of Adam 1, and we become liberated from the tumah of death by Adam 2. And, huh? Adam 2. Again, you have to go back to The Lonely Man of Faith. If you heard it last week, we talked about it, but if not, you can get the essay on the internet. It's very, very worthwhile to read. The Lonely Man of Faith by Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. And that is why Para Aduma purifies me. Again, it's like the ancient Greek myth of the phoenix bird. The phoenix bird is burnt into ashes, but it rises from the ashes. And by the way, people know it as a Greek myth, but the truth of the matter is, I shouldn't say it as a Greek myth. There's a Maimer Chazal that describes a bird the same way. Now, these things don't have to be literal. These types of midrashim are not meant to be literal. But there's something very deeply profound, and that is, in the process of what you might call self-destruction, I achieve rebirth. By self-destruction, I mean freeing myself from my egotism and my arrogance, which some people might describe as a form of self-annihilation, actually gives you a rebirth and a reconstitution that liberates you from death in a spiritual way. That's paraduma. So now Rav Tzadok says the following. With this idea, though, we can understand the bit of the paradox. Because on one hand, humility is a wonderful quality. But the humility, when taken in a wrong direction, it destroys your self-esteem, it destroys your worthiness, it destroys your sense that you can accomplish important things. It becomes destructive. There is the humility of submission to God that's empowering, and then there's the humility of a sense of worthlessness that empties you. And that's what paraduma is saying. The same ashes that can liberate you from death and bring you closer to God, if taken in the wrong direction, can make you tameh and destroy your relationship with God. There is, so to speak, the humility that elevates, and then there's the humility that destroys. And therefore paraduma, which is a symbol of that humility, encapsulates that particular paradox. So we have actually a little bit of a partial explanation of why paraduma does have that paradox. Now obviously, this cannot be a complete explanation. If it was, Shlomo HaMelech would have figured it out. If he didn't, there's still much more to say about it, but at least you have some type of sense of how this works. So wish you all a Shavua Tov, a good week, and we should all be safe. Kol tov.
Yipane, 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 yipane,